Because
it's ridiculous.
Christopher Walken could have come forward right then with the truth, and some justice would have been done.
Yes.
I don't know what would have happened to Christopher Walken's career. It doesn't matter. Somebody died out there. So let's start out with something that I've harped on from the very beginning, this matter of motive. In both investigations, nobody looked into a motive. Nobody looked into why, if Robert Wagner did have something to do with Natalie Wood's death, why would he want his wife dead? That was the first thing that I decided to do. So let's talk about these legal definitions. So what I decided to do was just do the law in 1981, because for the most part, it's the same. Let's talk about motive. This is what the legal definition of motive was back in 1981.
Okay.
Something as a need or desire that causes a person to act. Right? Okay. So somebody may desire to eliminate somebody for money, or somebody may need to eliminate somebody for personal reasons. That constitutes a motive. And then another definition is an emotion, need, desire, or impulse acting as an incitement to action. So let me give you an example from Natalie's investigation. One of the motives that I suggest existed at the time Natalie passed away was Wagner's fear of embarrassment and humiliation. When he and Natalie divorced the first time, even though it was totally his fault, instead of saying, well, this is my fault, the self-centered son of a gun starts trying to blame Natalie for it. And so what happens is when he separates from her, number one, his meal ticket is gone. Now he's got to try to make money on his own, and he wasn't a hot commodity, let's put it that way. So he loses his meal ticket. But when she started going out with Warren Beatty, for example, and some of these other folks, some were actors, some were business people, Natalie hit the ground running after her divorce. I mean, she was out there, okay? But Wagner, he was tormented by that. In his book, in his words, he said he was humiliated and that he was never going to let that happen again. Basically, he was never going to be humiliated like that again. And that's when he says in there that he had a gun and he fully intended to go out and shoot Warren Beatty.
Yes. Okay? Sat in his driveway.
Right. Yeah. That's what he said in his book.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So when he says that, we have to believe him that that's what he intended. What I suggested in the book was that after the fight Friday night, where Natalie, angry, told Dennis Davern to take her to the shore in Avalon, where she spent the night in the Pavilion Hotel, and told Davern, among other things, that she was going to go see her lawyer, that she was tired of Wagner's drunken aggravation over her co-stars in her movies.
Having been an actress, I had a lot of friends that knew Wagner, and I was told on the side that weekend, Natalie told Wagner that when she got back to Los Angeles, she had contacted a divorce lawyer and she was going to ask for a divorce.
And Wagner had acted that way before. So this wasn't something that just happened. And Natalie was ticked. And she was just about at her limit. And that's what she said that she was going to do after Wagner acted up on the boat over his jealousy of Walken. When Natalie fell off the boat, was pushed off the boat, however you look at it, it really doesn't matter if Wagner was there shoving her around and saying, "Get off my fucking boat," and things like that, which is what Davern says. When she hit that water, he looked down at her and thought, "Oh my gosh, if I pull her out of this water, what is she going to do? What are people going to think of me? You know, I'm a wife beater." All sorts of things, I'm sure, were running through his mind to losing his meal ticket again.
Yes,
Okay?
yes.
Now, he had heart to heart. I'm not saying that he was going to starve. I'm just telling you that his station in life was going to be reduced substantially.
Absolutely. I had no idea how much Natalie was worth until I read your book. The figures there, I think, would really be astounding to a lot of people. He really was in the position where he had a lot to lose financially. Yeah.
Okay, so now his wife's in the ocean after a fight that they had on the back of the boat. Mm-hmm. And he reaches down and he pulls her out of the water. Now, she happens to be Natalie Wood, who has a whole lot of friends and contacts in Hollywood. Sure. So Natalie has had it. So the next morning, when they go back to the mainland, Natalie's going to be on the phone to her lawyer, Paul Ziffrin. And the next thing you know, she's going to be filing a divorce. And there were two witnesses on the boat that could substantiate this argument and fight. I mean, he didn't know what they were going to say or what was going to happen. And the next thing you know, all over the media, it's Robert Wagner's out slapping Natalie Wood around and shoving her into the ocean. Mm-hmm. So it would have been awful. The media would have crucified him. They probably would have canceled his show. Even back in 1981, they probably.
I believe that. Yeah.
Because remember, the producers of that Heart to Heart were good friends of Natalie Wood's. Mm-hmm. So now let's talk about premeditation. A lot of people have the idea that in order for somebody to be guilty of murder that involves premeditation, that it has to be some kind of plan where they sit down and go, okay, I'm going to get a long-range rifle, and I'm going to go over to the neighborhood, and I'm going to hide behind a bush on a house next door, and then I'm going to wait for them to come in from work because I know that they come home from work right after dark. And when they get out of the car, I'm going to shoot them from behind that bush, and then I'm going to run through the alley and get in my car and get away. But that's not what the law is, all right? Here's what the law was in California in 1981, what I think it still is today. It's this: evidence of premeditation falls into three basic categories. Number one, planning and activity, which is what I just talked about. Number two, motive to kill the victim. See, you can have premeditation if you have a motive. If your motive is life insurance because you have a girlfriend and you need a bunch of money to be able to go to Bora Bora and hang out with her, and so because of that, it makes the murder premeditated. And then the third category of evidence is the manner of killing. So if you take a knife and you go over to somebody's house and you stab him 37 times, then a jury is going to be able to infer from that you did it in a premeditative and deliberative way. and therefore you've committed first-degree murder. Now, the law in California also said this: the definition of premeditation is careful thought and weighing considerations, okay, as a deliberate judgment or plan, not and plan, but or plan. So, deliberate judgment, all right? Deliberate judgment means this, that at the time you kill somebody, that you carefully weigh what you are doing. And if you point a gun at them and you shoot them, you can form premeditation in a matter of seconds. Because the law says this: it may be arrived at quickly. The law does not require an action be planned for any great period of time in advance. Premeditation is not measured by duration. That was the law in California. So, people might be thinking, oh my gosh, does that mean that Wagner was guilty of first-degree murder? A jury is also going to be told that in a murder case, it can be either first-degree murder that requires premeditation and deliberation, or it can be second-degree murder that requires what we call malice aforethought, but not include premeditation and deliberation. Mm-hmm. Well, let me say that again. Second-degree murder doesn't require premeditation and deliberation. First-degree murder does.
Okay.
So if I was the prosecutor, I wouldn't have charged Robert Wagner with first-degree murder. I would have looked at either having him indicted or charging him as a district attorney with second-degree murder.
We don't know how she ended up in the water.
Could have saved her, and they didn't save her. Would that be enough to bring charges in this case?
No, that's not. Believe it or not, there's no duty to act.
Now, here's the thing about second-degree murder. If you looked up first-degree and second-degree murder in California, the law at the time is going to tell you that both of them require what is called malice aforethought. Now, malice aforethought can be in two categories. It can be express malice aforethought, or it can be implied malice aforethought.
Okay.
Now, express malice aforethought is deliberate intention to take a life. Okay? Deliberate intention would be something like this. Let's say that some gang members are in a car and they're driving down the road, and one of them just sticks a gun out the window and fires at somebody walking by because they have the wrong kind of jacket on. Was that premeditated murder? That is, did they, with premeditation and deliberation, kill the person? Or was it just deliberate? There was no motive other than the jacket. And so a prosecutor would probably discharge him with second-degree murder. Now, the second part of malice aforethought is implied. And implied is this. Implied malice aforethought is circumstances attending a killing that show an abandoned and malignant heart. That is a killing that results from the defendant's act, which involves a high degree of probability that it will result in death, and which is done intentionally for a base, antisocial motive and wanton disregard for human life.
Okay.
Okay, so you see how there is a distinction between the kind of things, the killings of first-degree murder, and the kind of killings that would occur in second-degree murder.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You can do things that create a high degree of probability that somebody's going to die. Let's say you drove a car into a crowd, right? I mean, there's a high probability somebody's going to die. Okay. Now, if you planned it and you wanted to do that, if they were demonstrators and you wanted to kill as many of them as you could, well, then it elevates it to premeditated murder. See? People have also thought about, in Natalie's case, whether or not Robert Wagner could have been possibly guilty of manslaughter, and that's a possibility. If you went to trial and you were his defense attorney, that might be what you would claim. But here's the problem with that. In order to prove or establish manslaughter instead of second-degree murder, you have to basically agree that you had something to do with the person's death.
Yes.
Because you can't be guilty of manslaughter committed in a heat of passion unless you show facts that would establish that the killing was done in a heat of passion.
Gotcha.
And you see, Robert Wagner, from day one, has always said this was an accident. He didn't have anything to do with it. If he's going to be convicted of something based on that defense, unless he's going to change his defense now, which he could have possibly done if he was ever actually tried. If he changed his defense and said, well, it was manslaughter, and so all the things that I said before were all lies. What really happened was I was drunk and I pushed her and she fell overboard, and because it was dark, I just couldn't find her anymore and she drowned. Right? If that were the case, then that probably would be manslaughter. But he would have to say that now. You see what I mean?
Yes.
His attorney wouldn't be able to prove it without some evidence.
Yeah.
And of course, manslaughter, the statute of limitations is already expired. In criminal cases, the defense doesn't have to prove anything, but practically speaking, you do. There's one or two other things that I want to talk about, and then we'll get into these statements. The first thing is a term called consciousness of guilt. In my book, I talk about consciousness of guilt, and that is when people do things that create basically an awareness that they did something wrong. Like, for example, let's say that the police go over to somebody's house to interrogate them, and as soon as the person in there sees them, they take off running. Well, the Bible even talks about that. It says the wicked flee where no man pursueth, but the righteous are bold as a lion. So if you take off running, then a jury can infer your consciousness of guilt. You took off running because you were guilty of something and you didn't want these guys arresting you. You could explain it and say, well, I took off because I was scared. Mm-hmm. And so I took off and I shouldn't have done it. I mean, you could offer that evidence to explain it, but that's still an act which would substantiate consciousness of guilt under the law. Okay. Another one in Robert Wagner's case was the identification of Natalie's body. Mm-hmm. Instead of identifying his wife's body, he got in a helicopter, a sheriff's helicopter with Christopher Walken, and flew back to the mainland. And he sent his boat captain over to identify the body. Now, you think about that. What innocent person would do that? I mean,
absolutely.
It's supposed to be somebody you love.
Right. Yeah.
I know people would not want to see it, but what person would do that if their wife just disappeared one night and was found dead. Well, that could be an act of consciousness of guilt, see. It could be explained if there was actually a trial. And if the jury believed the explanation, well, then it wouldn't be an element of consciousness of guilt. But it's something a prosecutor could use. Okay? The second thing, which leads me into the statements that we're going to talk about tonight, is what's called a false exculpatory statement.
Okay.
Now, a false exculpatory statement is this. If you have a defendant charged with a crime, and when those police came to his house to ask him about it, he told them that, well, I have an alibi. I was at the movie at the time. And they say, well, what movie was on? Well, The Godfather. And so the police go out and they go to the movie house, and it wasn't The Godfather, it was Peter Pan. So you see, he made a false exculpatory statement. He wasn't in the movie watching The Godfather.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the jury can consider that to establish somebody's intent, guilty intent, or consciousness of guilt. Okay? And there actually is a jury instruction that says that you can consider it as part of the defendant's guilt if they make a false exculpatory statement. Once again, the defendant would have an opportunity to explain it, and if the jury accepted the explanation, well, there wouldn't be evidence anymore. Okay? So, having said that, let's talk about these statements. And there is some mighty interesting stuff when it comes to these statements. When I finally, after suing the sheriff the first time, when I finally succeeded in getting some records, one of the things I got were copies of the detectives' notes that they took while they were interviewing people. There was Detective Frazier, and then he had a sidekick, I think he was a crime scene investigator. I don't think he was a detective. His name was Hamilton.
Okay.
All right, so both of them, when they interviewed witnesses together, they both took notes. And by the way, Hamilton, his notes are more detailed and complete than Rasher's are.
Okay.
Because as you might imagine, it's hard to talk to somebody, ask them questions, and write notes at the same time. Yeah?
That makes sense.
So Rasher did make notes, but his notes aren't as good as Hamilton's notes. The second thing is, and this is real important, for some of these things I want to tell you about, the notes are identical, which means this, all right? And this is why I wanted the notes so bad. In all the years that I've been involved in the criminal law process, as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney, I know that the notes, the handwritten notes, are the best evidence of what somebody says to an investigator. Because when they dictate their report, it may be an hour or 2 hours or the next day, or maybe read somebody on Friday and it wouldn't be till Monday. For me, if I had to look at the official report or the notes and say, which is the most likely accurate document, I would take the notes 100% of the time.
That makes a lot of sense.
And in particular, I would take the notes when both sets of notes have the same words in them.
Yes.
Somebody says, I ran a red light, and it appears in the note, in both sets of notes, the likelihood that both persons made the same mistake on taking that note is very, very slim.
Wow.
So here we go. The very first interview that was done by Rasher and Hamilton was in Long Beach. It wasn't on Catalina Island. And it was on Long Beach because by the time they were assigned the case, they went to Long Beach to get on a helicopter and fly over to Catalina Island. Before they could get to Catalina Island, Walken and Wagner were landing in the sheriff's helicopter in Long Beach. So their first interviews were of Wagner and Walken. Very first interviews. Now here's what Hamilton wrote that Wagner said when he first was interviewed at 9:54. By the way, both investigators wrote down the time at 9:54. Okay.
Okay.
So they both looked at their watch at the same time when they sat down. So
that was definitely
that he was interviewed at 9:54 is pretty high. Okay.
I should say. Yeah.
So here's what Hamilton wrote that Wagner said, and it only takes up one page of the notes. It says this: "We were all in the boat. Beautiful night." Okay? Now that's important for those listening. Write down beautiful night.
Beautiful night.
She wanted to take the dinghy out. Write that one down. She wanted to take the dinghy out. And then it says Zodiac 50 horsepower. And that's what the Zodiac had as a motor, outboard motor. Okay. And then it says 4 people aboard boat. I started calling Harbor Patrol about 11:30 p.m. Now, for those of you listening, you write that down. You've written down beautiful night. She wanted to take the dinghy out, and he started calling the Harbor Patrol at 11:30 p.m. Then it goes on to say Dennis Davern and Christopher Walken on boat and had dinner on shore and didn't hear her take off and had the music going and saw the door open and the boat gone. And that's it. That's all it says. That's all Hamilton's written. Because the interview only took 6 minutes. Because at 10 a.m., they were talking to Walken. So it was really less than 6 minutes. All right. So now here's what Rasher says, which is very interesting. He writes down in captain's office at the Aero Bureau. So now we got Wagner and Walken, and we're in the captain's office in the Aero Bureau in Long Beach, okay, where they land the helicopters and stuff like that. Then he writes this, quite shook. Now, I have circled that tonight because of this, and I didn't put this in my book because I really don't have evidence of it. It's just a gut reaction that I have. I think the words quite shook, which are by themselves at the very top, right underneath Aero Bureau, I think they were added later. I don't think originally he wrote quite shook. And I think the reason for it was he was trying to make sure his notes had something in there to justify why he let Wagner go in less than 6 minutes. I have examined, as a prosecutor and defense attorney, tens of thousands of documents, maybe hundreds of thousands of documents. And one of the things as a prosecutor and one of the things as a defense attorney I did was attempting to find out whether or not people added things after the fact to try to substantiate their actions or their defenses or something like that.
Sure.
And I can tell you as the prosecutor, I caught a whole lot of people doing that.
Okay.
But in order to catch him, what you need is the original document. And they wouldn't let me see the original documents. They only gave me copies. And you can't discern this off of a copy.
Yeah,
And for those of you out there that like this kind of stuff, and I did, okay, I like this kind of stuff. What you do is, if you had the original document, you can send it to a question document examiner, and they'll take a little pin prick of the ink out of the words that you think were added later. Then they'll take a little pin prick of the words that you believe were in the original document, and they will analyze it and determine whether or not it's the same ink.
Wow.
So even if somebody's being sneaky and they get out a black pen and they write it in black pen because their original notes are in black, If you have the original document, you could tell whether or not the ink was different. And they change the lots on these inks all the time. Quite shook. And that's all he says. Now, it's real important because nowhere in Hamilton's notes does he describe Wagner's appearance. Now, Rasher wants you to believe in his notes that he was like taken back by the fact that Wagner was, quote, quite shook. But Hamilton, who's sitting there, probably not even asking the questions and responsible for taking the notes, doesn't write anything. To me, that also supports the proposition that was added later. Back to the notes. So Rasher writes this. He doesn't have anything in his notes like Hamilton's got in his notes. Not one word. Not beautiful night. Not she wanted to take the dinghy out. And not started calling the harbor patrol at 11:30 p.m. And you might ask, well, why in the world would he not do that? Well, because Rasher had been around as a detective for about 30 years. And Rasher knew exactly what false exculpatory statements mean. And Rasher would know that you could prove whether it was a beautiful night out by just asking people on the island or, some other methodology, calling the Coast Guard, having them testify about what the weather was that night. So he didn't write down any of it, all right? He especially didn't write down she wanted to take the dinghy out. And the 11:30 thing, of course, can also be substantiated, right? He first tried to call the harbor patrol at 11:30 p.m., he said. So he writes this, states they had been ashore at Isthmus, had dinner and a few drinks, went back aboard Splendor. She went below. They noticed the dinghy missing, then noticed Natalie was missing. He called to see if she went back to the bar. Recalls people searching. That's all he wrote.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, the significance of all that is, in just a few minutes, they were going to fly to the island. And when they did, they were going to be able to prove, okay, if they were really doing an investigation, that it wasn't a beautiful night. It was anything but a beautiful night, number one. And number two, he didn't start calling the harbor patrol at 11:30 p.m. Okay. The first call, even by his own admission in his book, was at 1:30 a.m. Now that's a big difference.
Absolutely.
And you got somebody in the cold Pacific Ocean who doesn't swim. Okay. 2 hours is a big difference.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. And finally, if he asked Davern and he asked Walken, was Natalie wanting to take the dinghy out for a spin? They might say no. Okay. And if they did, there would have been 3 items in a span of less than 6 minutes that Robert Wagner said that were false. False exculpatory statements.
Yes, I get it.
Now,
wow.
Let me tell you something else. Nothing that Hamilton wrote in his notes is in Rasher's official report. Nothing. There's no mention of any of those words. He did have Hamilton's notes when he was doing his official report. And he saw this because this was the very first interview they did.
Yeah.
Which establishes this, in my opinion. This investigation was over with at 9:54 a.m. Rasher never intended to try to go out there to examine whether or not Natalie Wood was the victim of a homicide. He never intended it from the second he was there. Rasher's official report is dated 11 days later, but it was over at 9:54 a.m. I would have given anything to be able to question Rasher over this.
Oh, God. I
Maybe
know.
or otherwise examine him over some of the things that he did. All right, now we go to the next interview. The next interview occurred at 10 o'clock in the morning at the Aero Bureau there in Long Beach.
Okay.
And it was of Christopher Walken.
Ah, yes.
Now let's see what they wrote in their notes about the interview with Mr. Walken.
When you do talk about Christopher Walken, I want people to listen very carefully to what you have to say about this, because I think through the years we have been so indoctrinated into hearing Christopher Walken didn't hear anything, he wasn't involved, he was in his room the whole time, and just sort of letting him off the hook and assuming that that's true. A lot of us just take that for granted because we've heard it so many times. In a way, we have really not been using our common sense with that.
Absolutely, and I'm going to show you in the statements that they made to the authorities, that he made to the authorities that day, I'm going to show you where what you said is exactly right, out of his own mouth. All right? Now, here's what they wrote down that he said at 10 o'clock in the morning, roughly 2 hours and 15 minutes after they found Natalie's body. Okay? This is what he says. Met them Friday morning, went to Avalon, had dinner, and then it says, settled in where we were. Okay? So right there, all right, right there, he doesn't tell these investigators about what happened Friday night that caused Natalie Wood, the famous actress, to leave a 60-foot yacht with the captain and go to Avalon at 11 o'clock at night to try to find a hotel room. Okay? He doesn't say anything about that in this particular interview, all right? Then he goes on and says, Saturday night, went out, had drinks. I had a lot. She can't drink. And then it says, had two. It is the words H-A-D and then the number 2. Then it says, RJ and I had a small beef. Okay? Well, this is Christopher Walken speak right here. This small beef. All right? Now, they don't ask him what he means by that, or if they do, they don't put it in their notes. What they do next is they write this, and both of them wrote this. Okay? This is one where both of them wrote the exact same thing. I ran outdoor. So after he said RJ and I had a small beef, they write, I ran outdoor. Okay? And then it says, came back and she went down to her room. Well, there's only one she, so he's talking about Natalie there. RJ, now listen to this one. You're going to love this one. RJ and I made up hugging each other.
Oh, my God. Sorry. What? Oh my goodness.
What? Now,
Those are
we already know now. We already know because Robert Wagner has confessed to it. And Dennis Davern said it happened about, I think it was like about 6 or 7 years after Natalie passed away. Davern said this for the first time, that they were having a conversation. Wagner got mad, picked up a wine bottle, and busted it over the coffee table. Absolutely. Glass and wine flying all over the place. And Christopher Walken did run out the door because he was scared half to death of this crazy man who just busted a wine bottle in his face. So, all right, so he doesn't say anything about the wine bottle or any of that other stuff, all right, that we know now happened. Beyond any shadow of a doubt, it happened.
We do. Yes, we do.
Right.
Yes.
So you see, this is why I get agitated when I start talking about Christopher Walken.
Ridiculous.
Christopher Walken could have come forward right then with the truth, and some justice would have been done.
Yes.
I don't know what would have happened to Christopher Walken's career. It doesn't matter. Somebody died out there.
Yes.
And
yes.
he was under an obligation to tell these investigators the truth.
Yes.
A
Yes.
prosecutor could look at that and say he violated the law back in 1981 if it became known that it was untruthful. Okay? So now we're hugging in the salon and everybody was happy. It says, didn't hear boat start. They must have asked him, well, did you hear the dinghy start up? And he said he didn't hear it because they thought she started it up and left the yacht. But we know when the dinghy was found, the key was off and it wasn't in the right position to be started. So it was like it just drifted to that place. Then it says, I thought she went to bed. I thought she thought we were a bunch of assholes. That didn't get in the official report either. The hugging each other didn't get in the official report. Then they finally say, I think Davern noticed dinghy going. We looked for the dinghy, then we looked for her. So he said, all right, we looked for the dinghy, and then we looked for her. Nowhere in this, anywhere, all right, for Hamilton's notes, does he say, well, I went to sleep and slept all night, and I was asleep when it happened, which has been his alibi for the last 42 years. Hamilton doesn't write anywhere Walken saying he was asleep all night and asleep when it happened. Okay. Now let's see what Brashear writes about what Walken had to say. He said they left Avalon at 11 o'clock and they spent some time Friday night, dinner on the boat. Again, see, there's no mention of this fight Friday night, Natalie leaving or any of that. So he withheld that information from him. And then Saturday, went to Isthmus at night, the bar, and then it says, has drinks, back to boat. Okay? And then it says, Nat, not much of a drinker. And then Wagner and Chris into small beef. So now both Hamilton and Brashear have written down that Walken said that there was a small beef. Okay? So now he inched a little close to what happened. But again, he didn't tell them all the details about what happened, like he should have. Nat sitting there seemed to disturb Nat. So I guess Brashear didn't want to write down there that she thought we were a bunch of assholes. Okay? So he just put down disturbed. She went to her room, did not hear the motor or small boat. And then it says, possibly after midnight, thought she went to bed. Okay, so I think he was trying to write, Brashear was trying to write that all of this occurred after midnight. Okay, which we know is not true. Again, we know it's not true. Shoreboat came and Wagner went to look for her, came back and could not find her or the dinghy. Okay, so he's saying in here to Brashear and Hamilton, they both wrote it down, that he was awake, that he was up there when Natalie disappeared, and that he was around when the search was going on for the dinghy and Natalie. Okay, he wasn't asleep all night, according to his own statements. So they write in their report, this is what he says about Friday night in the official report. He recalled that after they were aboard the boat, he and Robert Wagner got into a small beef. Then he doesn't say, now both of them wrote down in their notes, ran out the door. He doesn't say that. He said, he left the cabin. To me, there is a significance if somebody says they ran out the door, then somebody's saying, I left the cabin. Did these detectives bear down on him and question him about that at the time? No. They just let him go. I think the whole interview lasted, couldn't have been more than 5 or 10 minutes that they talked to him, maybe less. Then he says in the official report, next remembered a shoreboat coming alongside, and Mr. Wagner went ashore looking for the victim. He recalled Mr. Wagner returning and learning that neither she nor the dinghy had been found. And then it just says, this interview was terminated at this time. They didn't even give an excuse for terminating his interview and not really questioning about what went on. That's why I'm telling you that Rasher's intention was to make it look like it was an investigation.
He was a 30-year veteran, so it is inexcusable that somebody with his experience would not have pursued these things further.
He did things that a 30-year homicide detective veteran would not do. And he did not do things that a 30-year veteran would do.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we go to Dennis Davern. Okay,
Mr. Davern.
And this is what they say when they interviewed him at 11:22 a.m. Now, to set the stage, after Walken was released and Wagner was released, they got in that helicopter and they flew to either Avalon or to the Isthmus. I think it was to the Isthmus, but they could have flown to Avalon and been driven over to the Isthmus. So they started talking to people. And that's when I say that Rasher learned that, and Hamilton too learned, that Wagner had lied to him right out of the chute. But it didn't matter because they weren't about to try to show that Robert Wagner made some false statements to him, because that might suggest he was guilty of something, and they didn't want to do that. So they talked to Dennis Davern at 11:22 a.m. And he tells them this. We came to the Isthmus for dinner. We went back to the boat. Thought Natalie went down below to put on PJs for the night. Noticed Zodiac gone. And then, usually tied to stern, back of the boat, okay, usually tied to the stern. Called Harbor Patrol, kept calling. They said wait on Coast Guard. Well, that wasn't true. They didn't say that. And then it says called Long Beach Coast Guard this AM, went with the sheriff's office, found Zodiac later on, found her shore boat, towed Zodiac back to shore. And then they go back and say they first went to Avalon. They went to shore. I stayed on the boat. They went shopping. This is on Friday. And returned for dinner. They dropped anchor at Avalon. And that was because they didn't have any moorings. So they dropped anchor out by the casino building there. And then it says this, all four spent the night on the boat. Friday night. Which, of course, we know is a big lie.
Absolutely.
Right? Okay. Yeah. Saturday came to Isthmus, had mooring. We all had a drink in the bar, made reservations, stayed for dinner. This is Hamilton. He's writing about himself now. We asked about motel, and he wants to talk to RJ and his attorney before talking about that.
How guilty does that sound?
Yeah. So at that point now, they've talked to Wagner. They already know that half of what he said was false. They've talked to Walken, and he's told them about a small beef Saturday night. And now they talk to Davern. He lies to him about staying in the Pavilion Hotel, or they call it a motel, Friday night. Okay, so now they got people lying to him, and they got people suggesting that there was an argument between Wagner and Walken. And they know all this by 11:22 a.m. in the morning on Sunday. Natalie's only been gone a few hours by that time. Then they say they must have asked him about the broken wine bottles. Now, they hadn't gone to the Splendor yet, but Deputy Kroll did. Deputy Kroll went out there with Robert Wagner. When he talked to Robert Wagner, after he talked to him, they both went out to the Splendor to look at the Splendor, okay? And Kroll made a bunch of notes about what he saw out there, and one of the things he saw was broken glass on the floor and on this coffee table. So they apparently asked Davern, and Davern said maybe 6 broken wine bottles on boat due to rough seas. And then they must have asked him about an argument between Walken and Wagner, and Davern said this: rather not say about argument, which did not get into the official report. Because you see, if it would have gotten in the official report and somebody would looked at it and said, wait a minute, he didn't want to talk about this argument that apparently occurred between Walken and Wagner? Why is that? Now, this guy's got to be hiding something. Okay?
So many suspicious things.
Right.
So many. It's just so outrageous.
What we do is, because you see, I've never suggested that everybody in the sheriff's office was in on this.
Sure.
I don't think everybody was. I think it was Pitches and Rasher.
Mm-hmm.
I think Pitches talked to Rasher and said, you know what? Just go over there and interview a few people and let's wrap this thing up as an accident.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's what happened. He didn't put this stuff in his report because it shows at the bottom of it that carbon copies went to several people. So he didn't want these other people seeing all this stuff.
Yeah.
Because somebody might have said, well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. We got an argument here. We got people lying about stuff. We got her leaving the boat Friday night and going into shore and checking into a motel with the boat captain. I mean, something's going on here.
Yeah. So many suspicious things there.
Then we take a look at Rasher. And Rasher says this about what Davern said. One of the very first things he says is, captain of the ship, reservations made for dinner, back to boat, wine. And that says 12:35 a.m. Zodiac gone. Now, that did not make it into Rasher's report. Okay? Now, these are his notes. Another thing a detective knows in a case like this is the timeline is important. If you can establish a timeline for things like the time of death and that kind of thing, you can get a better picture about what was going on and who might be involved in what. Mm-hmm. And that is an important time because he's saying that it was 12:35 that they noticed the Zodiac was gone. Later on in the statements, they established that that's false. They have them getting back to the boat at 10:30, and then they have them specifically saying 15 minutes after that, this happened, and 15 minutes after that, that happened, and then we noticed that the dinghy was gone, which would have put it about 11 o'clock or so instead of 12:35.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I could hear a woman yelling, help me, somebody help me, I'm drowning. By that time, it was 11 o'clock. Now, the only reason I know the exact time was because John had given my son a digital watch. And so we kept yelling back to Anthony, what time is it? Because he stayed in his stateroom. And he kept telling us minute by minute what time it was.
Okay. At some point, did the cries for help stop?
At 20 after 11, the cries for help stopped.
I think that time scared him because he knew that Robert Wagner didn't make the first call for help until like about 1:30.
Yeah.
So we've got an unexplained hour here. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
That's why he didn't put it in there. Let me tell you something. Honestly, I can tell you, if I had these people under oath and I was in the courtroom, I would crucify them.